Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast. It's time for the view from the opposition. This week it comes from Daniel Blackham, who is a deputy sports editor for the US Mirror site, one of our sister websites here, The Chronicle, but more importantly, a Brentford fan. So he's going to provide the insight into the Bees as Newcastle head down to the G-Tech this weekend for what will be a very interesting game. Brentford come into the game having lost 3-1 to Aston Villa. Newcastle drew 3-3 with Liverpool at St James's Park. I mean, none of that matters at all, really, because Brentford are absolutely ace at home. Daniel, thank you for popping onto the podcast. Do the results at home tell the full story?
Well, thanks for having me. To be perfectly honest, yes, they do in terms of how well Brentford have played at home. The season so far, to be honest, has been a real chalk and cheese tale, home and away. Brentford just can't seem to play away at all. And this isn't the first time this has happened. There's been a couple of seasons in the past. I think Brentford's second season in the Premier League it might have been. They were really poor away from home. The season in the Championship under Thomas Frank, where again the away form really held them back. But the home form has just been incredible this season. They seem to have really sort of made the G-Tech a fortress this season.
And what's the reason for it? Because obviously up here at St James's Park, we like to think of it as somewhat of a fortress. Only, I think, 3 teams in 2024 have won here. And other than that, it's been a difficult place to come. The atmosphere, the cliche 12th man is what makes it up here. Is it similar down there at the G-Tech?
I'd say it's slightly similar. Yeah, I'd say that the way that the players seem to approach games is so much different at home. At home, we seem to be so much more aggressive and really take ownership of games. Pressing from the front foot. Whereas having watched the Aston Villa game last night was the perfect example of just sitting back for 80 minutes or so and just sort of letting the opposition have the ball as much as possible. Whereas at home, it's the exact opposite. The players are pressing from the front, three men attacking at all times. Whereas quite often away from home, we're quite willing to maybe have that second midfielder dropping back a little bit too much. Whereas, as I say, when we're at home, it's not uncommon to have the 3 attacking players and then an attacking midfielder as well, which is really just showing how eager we are to get men forward.
It's really strange because obviously the League Cup tie is coming up in a couple of weeks' time. So in this position, you usually look at each other and try and eye each other up and kind of work out how they're going to do in the cup. But obviously, it's a reverse fixture. You guys are coming up here, so you can't really learn anything maybe from Saturday's game because there is such a difference in how you guys do it at home to when you're on the road. But I'm really looking forward to the game, and it's interesting that you mentioned. When they play away, they kind of just sit back, but at home they're much more aggressive. And again, that's going to be the key on Saturday for Newcastle United. When they're allowed to counter-attack, they're at their brilliant best. When they have to control the game and have more of the ball, they're not too good at it. So just explain to our listeners and viewers how you think Brentford, in terms of what they will do with the ball, how they will go at Newcastle, how will they set up on Saturday?
So to be perfectly honest, this season, much like last season, to be perfectly honest, has been derailed by injuries to a certain extent. Brentford are without their first choice left back, first choice right back. That's been the case since Rico Henry actually did his ACL in the Newcastle game at Newcastle last season, which was over a year ago now. He's still not back, and so we're having to play one of our wingers at left back because there's no support for him. In midfield as well, we're now without Christian Norgard, the club captain, who is the sort of defensive rock in the middle of midfield. He's the one that sort of will sit around on the edge of the back four and just mop things up. He's out for this weekend, so that could throw everything up in the air. And Matthias Jensen, who is a bit more of a creative player, but he's more than willing to get stuck into tackles. He's also out. So in terms of the midfield, I'm not too sure how they're gonna line up. I would imagine that it'll be quite similar to last night. In terms of Vitaly Janelt will come into that role and sit in front of the back four. He's been a somewhat of a club icon since he joined. And I think it was like £500,000 Brentford paid for him. Absolute bargain a few years ago. And yeah, he's the defensive work that he puts in. The only problem is that he doesn't really give that same output on the other end of the ball when it's time to go forward. In terms of where I think Brentford can really hurt Newcastle, I would imagine it's going to be with the front 3. I'm led to believe that Newcastle's fullbacks, Lewis Hall and Livramento, there's 2 very good defensive players, which is quite annoying because Brentford like to attack from out wide with Bryan Mbeumo, Kevin Shade, or Johan Wissa if he's put out on the wing. But Nick Pope's distribution, I think, could be an area where Brentford can sort of potentially get some success. I mean, I know that he's not too comfortable on the ball with the ball at his feet, whereas Kevin Shade's speed. When you talk about fast forwards like Kevin Shade, everyone thinks, sit on the last man and, ping balls over the top. That's not really where the speed comes into effect. It's when, the goalkeeper thinks he has 5 seconds, but the speed of the attacker pressing him, he only has 2. And so Nick Pope's going to be put under a lot more pressure on Saturday than I think he's used to. So I'd imagine that that's where Brentford can really, really hurt them. In terms of how they're going to line up, I would imagine it's going to be a 4-3-3. But as I say, how we played at home, we've had that attacking midfielder at the sort of top of the midfield diamond. So you'd imagine that it's going to be Vitaly Yanelt. I'd imagine Yarmolenko as well in midfield. He's a young Ukrainian player. He's very, very highly rated. He's sort of got a long-term contract, and I think the club is really, really behind his development. I would imagine he's going to be the sort of the box-to-box midfielder in that 3. And then Mikael Damsgaard, who's been one of the 4 players of the season so far, I'd imagine he's going to sit at the top of that diamond and get the ball in the sort of final third and try and make things happen. Up front, Bryan Mbeumo has been, again, he's been superb this season. He's sort of gone off the boil a little bit in the last few games. I don't know if that's, sense of over-relying on him a little bit too much last season and going into this season. Johan Wissa has been, again, one of those 4 players of the season. And then Kevin Shade's come into his own over the last week or so. A lot's been expected of him. He scored a hat-trick on Saturday, and that was the sort of, you'd imagine that was the sort of the start point for his Brentford career as well. I'd say his speed is just frightening. So when it comes to the pressing, that's going to be so important on Saturday.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting because you're correct. If someone's in the face of Nick Pope, there can be a little bit of panic. Dan Burn not too comfortable on the ball as well. So if they can get into the faces of Nick Pope in the defence, then yeah, you definitely could have some success. I'm just trying to work out though, because I had a little look at the possession stats and what have you. So in terms of when Brentford aren't pressing high, is it a case that they will take control of the game in terms of they like to have the ball and pass it around, or is it a case they like to give it to the visitors and say to the visitors, you're going to have to break us down, and then when you do, or you'll try, we'll stop you and we'll hit you on the counter?
To be perfectly honest, I think it's a bit of both. I think that there are going to be stretches of the game where Brentford have a lot of the ball, and you see them sort of passing it around out wide, and then there's sort of triangles on either flank. There's going to be stages where Brentford are going to say, okay, let's take an extra 10 yards back, sit back a little bit more, and then they've got the pace up front to attack quickly. Especially, as you say, with Newcastle defenders don't exactly love the ball being at their feet. So you'd imagine that there is going to be, there may be a 10-15 minute spell where in each half where Brentford sit back, and that's potentially when the home crowd gets a little bit restless and a little bit sort of wanting the players to push forward a little bit more. But when they've got the ball, they'll attack quickly. You'll see a lot of the time having the 2 fullbacks that Brentford have, it's going to be Vandenberg on the right hand side, I'd imagine, and Keane Lewis Potter on the left hand side. Keane Lewis Potter is a left winger anyway by trade, so he loves getting forward. So a lot of the time you'll see him pass the ball inside, make a long run upfield. Brentford might pass it around in the middle for a bit, and then look to get it out wide straight away, because he can then hurt the team on the attack. That allows Kevin Shade to drift inside a little bit. So yeah, having those 2 fullbacks getting forward as much as possible is going to be key to how Brentford use the ball.
Certainly going to be an interesting game of the styles Brentford kind of changed throughout, and obviously that means Newcastle will have to adapt, which I think they're a little bit better at doing, rather than having to control the entire game for 90 minutes or so. If they have to chop and change between having a bit of the ball and then being a counter-attacking side, I think that suits them a little bit more. But yeah, they're so important when they get to really absorb pressure and hit them on the counter. That's where Newcastle are most dangerous. But I mean, I look at Brentford and big fan of Thomas Frank. I think he's done a fantastic job. Great manager. Big fan of Bryan Mbeumo, as the listeners and viewers to this podcast know. He's my number 1 choice for January. Just how good is he? And I mean, there's been talk of a £50 million price tag at the very least, and some Newcastle fans have turned their noses up on that and said, really? But from what I've seen and the stats, it looks like it'd be worth every penny, £50 million.
To be perfectly honest with you, I think you're going to have to compete with Liverpool if Mo Salah goes. Because, I mean, you think about it, he's the perfect Mo Salah replacement if he ends up leaving Liverpool next summer. he's been such a revelation for us this season and last. He can play out on the wing, he can play through the middle if you want him to. He can play as a second striker and sort of make those runs in behind. He loves getting the ball at his feet and running at players. I'd say he has had a couple of quiet games. I think that over the last 3 games, he might not have exactly shown too much, and he sort of let the other 2 attackers, take ownership, as it were. But oh my gosh, he's an incredible footballer. I'm bracing myself for us losing him next summer, to be perfectly honest, because it's a bit like the Ivan Toney situation where you knew that he was destined for bigger things, and it's a shame to see Ivan Toney go where he did. I thought that he could have gone somewhere like an Arsenal or a Chelsea and compete in European football. I'd like to think that when Bryan goes, it'll be the same thing. In terms of a transfer fee, Bryan joined in the summer of 2019, which is when Brentford had one of their best transfer windows. They signed Pontus Jansson, I think Ethan Pinnock at the same time, Jensen and Norgard. So it shows how long that midfield has been as it is. Bryan Mbeumo was in that forward 3 with Ollie Watkins and Said Benrahma, and it wasn't just me who was thinking, when this guy goes, he's going to be the most valuable of all, because the way that he takes on players, he doesn't have any fear about getting the ball at his feet and running at someone. But at the same time, if he spots an early cross that he can make, he's more than comfortable whipping the ball in from either side. And his finishing as well has come on leaps and bounds over the last 2 years. The first season he was in the Premier League, he struggled with his finishing a little bit. I think he massively was outperformed by his XG. He was hitting the post like once every 3 games, whereas now he seems to have really found an eye for goal. Which I love him. I'm dreading the thought of losing him, to be perfectly honest, but I know that it's probably going to happen. And if Newcastle end up getting Europe next season, it seems like a logical move for him, because I'm not too sure who else would play on that right wing for Newcastle. Harvey Barnes.
Harvey Barnes, unfortunately for him, is predominantly on the left. He did come on the right against Liverpool, but was largely ineffective. And that's the big issue, is that you've got Anthony Gordon and Harvey Barnes, 2 top quality players, vying for the left, and obviously only one of them can play. Gordon can play on the right or up top, but he's just not as good. And at the moment, it's Gordon's spot, and Barnes just seems to have that impact off the bench. So it's Murphy at the moment. Jacob Murphy had a few chances against Liverpool, which he should have scored, and he didn't do. But definitely the need to get a right winger in. If not in January, then the summer. So I think, from what I understand, it is between him and Elanga that they like the most. But of course, that's, you can like a player and still not sign them. So one to watch. But I guess you could look around the Brentford side and pinpoint 3 or 4 people that you might be scared of losing, and not necessarily in January, but over the next couple of years, because there's so much talent in there. And my viewers and listeners here will say, stop talking up the opposition. But look, I love Brentford. I think they're a great side. So I'm going to take the opportunity. People like Lewis Potter, I think, is absolutely fantastic player. You've mentioned Wissa. Big fan of the left back, Rico Henry, who's injured, as you mentioned. I would love him at Newcastle United, or I would have done before Lewis Hall found his feet. I think the transfer business that you guys do is fantastic, and just generally the setup of the club. I think a lot of Premier League fans would be very envious of the way Brentford's ran as a club, because it seems to be run very well, not just with the transfers, but also just within the community as well.
For sure. I mean, in terms of the transfers, they seem to always be thinking 2 years in advance. They seem to always be thinking, the long term, rather than just, oh, there's a gap in the team, let's plug it in the transfer window. I would heavily doubt that anyone's going to leave in January. That's never really been Brentford's model, to let players go in January. And especially Bryan Mbeumo, when he's probably worth about 10 points over that stretch from January to the end of the season. So I can't imagine it would take a ludicrous bid for him to leave in January. Whereas next summer, I think that's when they'd be more comfortable letting him go, because it's like, okay, now we can start to plan. Now we can say, okay, well, he's gone, so who do we put on the right wing? But in terms of that planning, when he goes, they've got Kevin Schade, who they brought in. Everyone thought at the time that he was going to be the Ivan Toney replacement. It was, okay, this guy can play through the middle. We know Ivan Toney's going to go at some point. He ended up going about 18 months after Schade arrived, whereas it now appears that Igor Thiago is going to be the Ivan Toney replacement. Brentford's club record signing, made in the summer. he's only played twice in the Premier League. Both have been sub appearances because he had an injury after he came. But, they've got the likes of, I say, Keane Lewis-Potter, who they signed, and when he signed, there was sort of not really a space in the team. But as you say, it's that forward planning. It's that, okay, well, let's plan for in 18 months' time when this player leaves or when this player leaves. It's the same with Gustavo Nunes. I think Brentford fans are really excited about him. He's a young Brazilian. I think he's 19 years old now. Again, he's injured at the moment, but you know full well that he's going to be, I think he can play on either wing. He's comfortable with the ball at his feet, taking players on. So he very much fits the Bryan Mbeumo mould. That's how Brentford like their wide players to play. And as you said, that's the same on the left-hand side with Kevin Shade. I'd say the only time that recruitment hasn't really come off is with the fullbacks. When Rico Henry got injured last season, a lot of fans were crying out for a left back to be signed in January. But the point was very, very well made of, well, how do you sign a player knowing that they're probably not going to play once Rico Henry gets back? And Rico Henry's he's not exactly old. He's going to be the long-term left back. So how do you convince a player to come knowing that they're going to be relegated to second choice? And that's the same with Aaron Hickey when he had his injury. So they found it a little bit tough there. Thankfully, they've got Christopher Ayer and they've got Sepp van den Berg, who are both centre-backs who can play right-back, so they can cover that wide position. They've signed Jayden Magoma from Southampton, deal worth, I think, about £5 million. Really exciting left-back. Hasn't played too often for Brentford. I think he's basically been a cut player for us so far because they're very reluctant to sort of rush him into the first team and potentially risk ruining his confidence with a bad game. But as you say, that's just another example of that long-term planning of, okay, well, even if it's in 3 years, if Rico Henry leaves, we've got his replacement already at the club. We don't have to then react to things. They don't seem to like reacting to things in the transfer market. And yeah, I mean, the way the club's been run, and a lot of that stems from Thomas Frank. And I think that he's been linked with big jobs in the past. He was linked with Man United. I don't know how concrete that was. Any time a big job comes available, I always get worried that he's going to go. But the thing that he seems to have said is that he's not going to find too many other clubs where he has this relationship with the director of football and the owner, where everything seems to be run as a joint operation. He's not just left to, coach the players that he has. He has a real say when it comes to recruitment, when it comes to how the club is operated. And I think that's the reason that we've been able to keep him so long, because the club is so well run off the pitch.
Yeah. You are right. He's always linked to the big jobs. I was quite glad he didn't go to Manchester United, because then I wouldn't be able to like him very much, because who likes Manchester United? Not many people, especially not many people watching this. Tell me then, Brentford's biggest strength. What do we have to look out for?
To be perfectly honest, it's been a sign of how good this season has been for Brentford, especially at home. When you consider that if the player of the season was voted today, there's 4 players who you could realistically see getting it. Nathan Collins has been incredible at centre back. He struggled a little bit last season when he first joined from Wolves, and he had that horror game against Wolves where, I think he accidentally got 2 assists for Wolves despite playing for Brentford. It was that bad. Whereas now he's best defender we have at the club at the moment. So he's going to really be tasked with taking care of Alexander Isak on Saturday, which he terrifies me, to be perfectly honest. Alexander Isak, his pace, his strength, that's going to be a real task. But if there's anyone who can deal with him, fingers crossed, it's Nathan Collins, because as I say, he's just been a man mountain at the back, and he's so comfortable on the ball as well that he can happily win a tackle and then dribble upfield. He got an assist for Kevin Shade on Saturday doing that exact same thing. So I'd say that he's one to definitely look out for. Mikkel Damsgaard has been another one who struggled after he first joined the club. And again, he was part of the long-term planning of, they didn't rush him into the first team, even though he was probably ready. He had a lot of injury issues. He had a lot of, I think it's been well documented, he had confidence issues as well. Whereas now we signed Fabio Carvalho in the summer and everyone thought, okay, well, maybe that's going to be phasing out Mikkel Damsgaard. And all of a sudden he seems to have gained his confidence and he's causing problems for defenders all over the place. And he's, pinging balls left, right and centre and slotting it through the centre-backs and that sort of thing. He's been an absolute game changer. The other two, obviously Johan Wissa. Everyone hoped that he would step up to the plate with Ivan Toney gone. I don't think anyone expected him to do this well. I think he's 9 goals this season, I think, so far. Yeah, no one could have really expected that, to be perfectly honest with you. And yeah, the other one is just Kevin Shade is such a wild card. He's got that pace to cause problems. He could have a quiet game. He could, not impact too much. But if Brentford managed to get him going and managed to press from the front with him, he could cause real issues for not just Nick Pope, but for that whole Newcastle back line.
So a few players there for Eddie Howe and his team to watch out for. What's the main weakness that you think Eddie Howe will be looking to exploit on Saturday from Brentford?
To be perfectly honest, and this isn't me just trying to sound too overconfident, I'm not too sure what the weakness is in Brentford. The one thing that I would say is the Mark Flecken, Brentford's goalkeeper, is a little bit unpopular with Brentford fans. I think a large part of that was he was replacing David Raya, so he was basically tasked with doing the impossible. David Raya is one of the best goalkeepers in the world, and we were lucky to have him. He faces far too many shots at the moment, and I think that he was one of the top 5 best performing goalkeepers in the top 5 leagues at the start of the season. And despite the fact that he hadn't kept a clean sheet at that point, and that just shows how many shots he faces. And you can put that down to the fact that teams are attacking us out wide because they know the fullback issues. And you could also say that in front of the back four, the likes of Bruno Guimaraes can really take advantage of the fact that Christian Norgard isn't in the team on Saturday. You'd imagine that if he's the one who's sitting in front of the defence, or in that advanced midfield slot, which I believe that's how Bruno plays. There's no Norgard on Saturday and there's no Jensen, and Vitaly now can be found out. To be perfectly honest, he's a brilliant footballer, but he's not at that same level of defensive ability as Christian Norgard. So you'd imagine that they're going to attack through the middle, Newcastle, and especially with Alexander Isak being as good as he is. Ethan Pinnock, Brentford's other centre back, alongside Nathan Collins, he struggled badly this season. Gave away a penalty against Villa last night. So you'd imagine that Newcastle would or should use Bruno Guimaraes through the middle and use any other sort of technically gifted midfielders in that midfield space, and then just attack through Isak through the middle, because that's probably where they're going to have the most success.
It was interesting against Liverpool that we saw Tonali kind of in that middle, in that 6 with Bruno the other side of him. But basically what happened, one would go forward and the other one would sit, and it worked really, really well. The two of them kind of dominated that midfield area, spraying passes about, looking threatening. We just, from Newcastle point of view, need to see it on a consistent basis. It's a lot easier in a way if you're counter-attacking to maybe see that work. It's a bit different if you need to have a bit more control of the ball, but it'll be a lot of eyes on those two on Saturday to see if they can take advantage of the space on the pitch. And then just finally, Daniel, before I get your score prediction, what are you expecting from Newcastle? Is it a fixture you fear, or does it not really matter because you guys are at home and it's the G Tech that the visitors should be fearing?
I mean, it shouldn't be a game that I'm fearing because Brentford have been so good at home this season. But Newcastle, I'm never overly confident because Brentford have not beaten Newcastle in the league for goodness knows how many years. Haven't been in the Premier League since Brentford have been in the Premier League. I think lost or drawn every single time, including last season when at the end of last season Brentford played at the G Tech. That was towards the end of the season, so Brentford had sort of tapered off a little bit. So I'm not confident, to be perfectly honest. But I do think that if ever there was a time for Brentford to beat Newcastle in the league, it's now, because Brentford have been so impressive at home and so aggressive at home and so attackingly minded at home. What I'm expecting is goals, to be perfectly honest, because I think the Brentford are going to throw a lot forward. But as I say, defensively, Brentford can be sort of found out slightly. So I would be stunned if it was a 0-0, put it that way. Yes, I'm incredibly nervous about playing Newcastle. I weirdly feel more comfortable about the Carabao Cup game, even though that's up at Newcastle. Just because I think if Newcastle rest players and they don't play the likes of Isak and Gordon, maybe if they give Bruno a rest, I'm not too sure how Eddie Howe would approach that game. But Brentford's sort of second unit of players as well, when the likes of Fabio Carvalho come into the team, Igor Thiago will start that game to gain minutes, and Brentford's squad is very strong at the moment. So that Carabao Cup game, I'd feel more confident about than this weekend. But as I say, if ever there's a time for us to win against Newcastle in the league, hopefully it's now.
Is there kind of more pressure on Saturday because of how bad the away form is? You know, at the moment you're winning at home, unbeaten at home, so it kind of masks how bad you guys are on the road. But as soon as you lose that first game at home, the things don't come to a head. But you know, it kind of makes the away issue a little bit more into the forefront.
Yeah, to be perfectly honest, I hadn't even thought of that. But you've got a point there. And I've been very fortunate to not have to think about that because Brentford have been so good at home. But you're right. As soon as that streak goes, there could obviously then be, you know, the doubts that creep in about, oh, you know, now we need to really fix the away issues. But to be perfectly honest, I think the Brentford have bought themselves enough of a cushion so far with the home form to not hit the panic button. If anything, you know, if Newcastle come into Brentford on Saturday and win 5-0, I don't think anyone at Brentford would be panicking as much. I don't think that everyone would be going, oh gosh, you know, now we need to really sort things out. I think it would be just a sort of, you know, we know that we can win games. We know how we can play. So, you know, if we do end up losing at home, which obviously we will at some point anyway, when that defeat comes, I'd like to think that the dressing room is mature enough as well to know, you know, okay, this is one game, still a good team. Let's calm down a little bit. I think the fans may worry a little bit more, and the fans may sort of worry about masking the poor away form. But I'd like to think that in terms of how Brentford play and how they approach games, I'd like to think that it wouldn't change too much.
Well, it is the battle to get established in that top 10. Newcastle at 10th, Brentford at 9th, 20 points each. A win could see them go up as high as 5th. I think Brighton and Tottenham must play tonight at the time of recording. So either one of them wins, that kind of changes it slightly. But a win for Tottenham would take them on 23. A win for Brighton would take them up to 26. But basically, what I'm saying is there is room for manoeuvre up that table for either side that wins on Saturday. Other results go in their way as well. So it's so congested down there, and it's unbelievable, isn't it? Like a couple of wins and you'll be up to third or fourth. So both sides will be going for this. Thank you very much, Daniel, for popping me on to the podcast and providing the insight into the Bees ahead of Newcastle's visit to the G-Tech on Saturday. This episode is brought to you by NORD VPN. Like I said, the podcast description box is where you can get your discounted offer to keep yourself safe and all your personal details online as well. To you guys watching, thank you as always. You know what I do. Give a thumbs up, hit share, hit subscribe, leave a review, leave any comments. I'll get back to you, and I'll see you guys very soon.